In the spring of 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, a man once left for dead as a boy rose to unite the fractured clans of the Mongol steppe under a single banner. They called him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Within 70 years, the empire he founded would stretch from the Pacific shores of Korea to the gates of Vienna, the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years would vanish in a single afternoon. Rivers would run black with ash. And yet, from this devastation, a new world order would emerge, one of open trade routes, exchanged ideas, and connected continents. This is the story of how a small nomadic confederation, driven by grievance, ambition, and an almost incomprehensible mastery of mounted warfare, brought the medieval world to its knees. It is a story of brilliant strategy and brutal consequence, of khans who reshaped borders that still exist today, and of a legacy so vast that historians still argue whether the Mongols were the greatest destroyers, or the greatest builders, in human history. To understand how it began, we must return to a boy named Temujin, and the steppe that shaped him. The Eurasian steppe in the 12th century was a world few outsiders understood. It was a sea of grass stretching from Manchuria to the Carpathians, home to clans who lived and died on horseback, moving with the seasons in search of pasture for their herds. Among these clans, no single authority ruled. Alliances shifted with the wind. Blood feuds passed from father to son for generations. Into this world, around the year 1162, a boy named Temujin was born into the Borjigin clan, the son of a minor chieftain named Yasujii. His childhood offered no hint of the empire to come. When Temujin was still young, his father was poisoned by rival Tatars, and the family was abandoned by their own clan, left to survive alone on the open steppe. Temujin and his mother, Holun, foraged for roots and hunted small game to keep the family alive. It was a childhood defined by hardship, betrayal, and an early, brutal lesson: loyalty on the steppe was fragile, and strength was the only lasting currency. As a young man, Temujin began rebuilding what his family had lost. He formed alliances through marriage, most notably to Borte, whose kidnapping by a rival tribe, the Merkits, forced Temujin into his first major military campaign. He forged bonds not through blood alone but through a radical idea for the time: personal loyalty and merit could matter more than clan lineage. Warriors who proved themselves could rise regardless of birth. This meritocratic core would later become one of the defining features of Mongol military organization. Over the following decades, Temujin fought a series of wars against rival confederations, the Tatars, the Karait, the Naiman, and the Merkit, absorbing defeated tribes into his growing following rather than exterminating them outright, a strategy that steadily multiplied his strength. By 1206, after decades of shifting alliances and brutal campaigns, Temujin had done what no steppe leader had achieved in centuries: he had unified virtually all the Mongol and Turkic tribes of the eastern steppe under one rule. At a great assembly, a Kurultai, on the banks of the Onon River, the tribal leaders proclaimed him Genghis Khan. What followed was not simply the rise of a new steppe confederation, but the birth of a military machine unlike anything the settled world had encountered. Genghis Khan reorganized his forces along strict decimal lines, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, breaking apart old tribal loyalties and replacing them with a chain of command built on discipline and personal allegiance to the Khan. Every Mongol male of fighting age was, in effect, a soldier, trained since childhood in mounted archery. Mongol horsemen could fire composite bows accurately while riding at full gallop, switch mounts mid-campaign to maintain speed over vast distances, and coordinate complex battlefield maneuvers using signal flags and whistling arrows. Their armies moved with a speed and endurance that no contemporary force could match, often covering 60 miles a day. Genghis Khan also understood something his rivals did not: siege warfare, espionage, and psychological terror could be as decisive as the battlefield charge. He recruited engineers from conquered peoples to build siege engines capable of breaching the walled cities of China and Central Asia, technology the Mongols themselves had never needed on the open steppe. The first major targets of this new war machine were the settled kingdoms bordering Mongolia. Beginning in 1209, Genghis Khan turned against the Tangut kingdom of western Xia, forcing it into submission and extracting tribute. He then turned his attention to the far greater prize, the Jin dynasty of northern China, a wealthy and populous empire that had long treated the Mongols as unruly vassals. The war against the Jin, beginning in 1211, exposed the steppe army to the wealth, technology, and administrative sophistication of settled civilization, lessons the Mongols absorbed and adapted rather than ignored. Northern Chinese cities fell one after another. In 1215, the Jin capital of Zhongdu, near modern Beijing, was captured and burned. But it was an event far to the west that would transform the Mongol conquests from a regional war into a hemispheric catastrophe. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarazmian Empire, a vast Muslim state controlling Persia and Central Asia, hoping to open peaceful commercial relations. The governor of the border city of Otrar, suspecting the merchants of espionage, ordered the entire caravan executed and seized their goods. When Genghis Khan sent envoys to demand justice, the Khwarazmian Shah, Muhammad II, had them killed as well, an act of diplomatic insult that historians widely regard as one of the great strategic miscalculations in world history. Genghis Khan responded not with a punitive raid, but with total war. In 1219, he led an army estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 horsemen into Central Asia, and what followed was a campaign of annihilation. The great cities of the Khwarazmian Empire, Otrar, Bokhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Merv, Nishapur, fell in rapid succession. Contemporary chroniclers, including the Persian historian Javani, described populations being driven from cities and systematically massacred, skilled artisans deported to serve the Mongol war effort, and irrigation systems that had sustained Central Asian agriculture for centuries deliberately destroyed. While historians continue to debate the exact scale of the casualties, with some medieval sources offering figures modern scholars consider exaggerated, there is broad consensus that the Khwarazmian campaign inflicted demographic devastation on a scale rarely matched in pre-modern warfare. Within 2 years, one of the most powerful Muslim states in the world had ceased to exist. The destruction of Khwarazm sent shockwaves across the Islamic world and beyond, but Genghis Khan was not finished expanding the boundaries of the possible. In 1220, he dispatched 2 of his most trusted generals, Subutai and Jib, on a reconnaissance campaign that would become one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. Riding west through Persia and the Caucasus Mountains, defeating Georgian, Alan, and Cuman forces along the way, the 2 generals eventually encountered a coalition of Rus principalities at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. The Mongols annihilated the combined Rus and Cuman army through a feigned retreat, a tactic that would become a hallmark of Mongol battlefield deception, luring overconfident enemies into pursuit before turning to encircle and destroy them. Having proven that Mongol forces could operate thousands of miles from their homeland and defeat any army sent against them, Subutai and Jib turned back east, having completed a reconnaissance circuit of almost the entire known world. Genghis Khan died in 1227, during a final campaign against the rebellious Western Xia, and the empire passed, through a formal Kurultai, to his son Ogdi. Rather than fracturing, as many contemporaries expected, the Mongol Empire under Ogdi entered its most expansive phase. The Jin dynasty was finally destroyed in 1234. And in 1235, at another great Kurultai, the Mongols made a fateful decision, a massive western campaign into Europe, again commanded by the aging but brilliant Subutai, now serving under Baghdad Khan, grandson of Genghis. What followed between 1236 and 1242 was an invasion that shattered the medieval world's assumptions about its own safety. The Mongols first crushed the Volga Bulgars and the Kuman-Kipchak Confederation, then turned on the Rus principalities. City after city fell: Ryazan, Vladimir, Moscow, and finally Kiev in 1240, the mother city of Rus civilization, reduced to rubble so thoroughly that a visiting friar years later described finding fields littered with human skulls. With Rus broken, the Mongol war machine turned towards Central Europe in the winter of 1241, launching a coordinated two-pronged assault that revealed the terrifying strategic sophistication of Mongol high command. One force under Baidar and Khadan struck into Poland, annihilating a combined army of Polish nobles and Teutonic knights at the Battle of Legnica. Simultaneously, hundreds of miles to the south, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai crushed the army of King Bela IV of Hungary at the Battle of Mohi. Both European armies, despite their heavy cavalry and fortified positions, were outmaneuvered and destroyed within days of each other, a level of coordination across such distances that European commanders could scarcely comprehend. With Hungary conquered and Mongol scouts reportedly probing toward Vienna and the Adriatic coast, Western Europe braced for what seemed an inevitable catastrophe. Then, in December 1241, word reached the Mongol commanders that Great Khan Ogdi had died in Mongolia. Under Mongol law, senior princes were required to return to the capital, Karakorum, to participate in selecting his successor. Baghdad Khan withdrew his armies from Hungary and Central Europe, ending the Western campaign. Historians continue to debate whether logistics, terrain, or political necessity weighed most heavily in this withdrawal, but the succession crisis undeniably provided the immediate trigger. Europe, effectively defenseless before the world's most formidable army, was spared further invasion, not by military victory, but by the accident of a Khan's death thousands of miles away. The Mongol Empire, now the largest contiguous land empire in history, continued to expand under successive Khans, though increasingly as a set of loosely connected khanates rather than a single unified state. In the Middle East, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, led a campaign that culminated in 1258 with the siege and sack of Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate and one of the great intellectual centers of the Islamic world. The city's libraries, including the fabled House of Wisdom, were destroyed, and contemporary accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from discarded manuscripts and red with blood. The last Abbasid caliph was executed, traditionally said to have been wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses to avoid spilling royal blood directly onto the ground, though scholars note this detail comes from later tradition rather than contemporary confirmation. The fall of Baghdad marked, for many historians, the symbolic end of the Islamic Golden Age. Mongol expansion, however, was not limitless. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in present-day Israel, a Mongol force was defeated by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, the first major battlefield defeat the Mongols had suffered in decades, and a turning point that halted their advance into North Africa and the remaining heartlands of the Islamic Mediterranean. Around the same period, the unified empire began fragmenting into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia under Kublai Khan, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Golden Horde across Russia and the Pontic steppe. Kublai Khan would go on to complete the conquest of Song dynasty China by 1279, becoming the first foreign emperor to rule all of China, and establishing a dynasty that welcomed foreign travelers such as the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, whose accounts, however embellished in places, introduced Europe to the scale and sophistication of the Mongol-ruled East. The human cost of this era of conquest remains one of the most debated questions in historical demography. Estimates of total deaths attributable to the Mongol conquests, spanning roughly 7 decades and 3 continents, range from tens of millions to figures approaching 100 million when accounting for the ensuing famines, disease, and the collapse of agricultural infrastructure across Persia and China. Some modern scholars argue that global population data suggests a measurable decline correlating with the period of Mongol expansion, though isolating the Mongols' direct responsibility from concurrent factors such as the spread of plague remains methodologically difficult. What is not disputed is the sheer scale of urban destruction. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years, centers of learning, trade, and administration, were erased in single campaigns, their populations killed, enslaved, or scattered. And yet, to understand the Mongol Empire only as an engine of destruction is to miss half the story. In the wake of conquest, the Mongols imposed something the fractured medieval world had rarely known: connected, police trade routes stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. A period later historians would call the Pax Mongolica. Merchants, missionaries, and diplomats could travel the Silk Road under Mongol protection with a level of safety unmatched in prior centuries. Ideas, technologies, and goods moved with unprecedented speed. Gunpowder, printing techniques, and astronomical knowledge flowed from China westward, while Persian, Arab, and European innovations moved east. The Mongols, despite their reputation, were notably tolerant of religious diversity within their empire, generally allowing Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others to practice freely so long as they submitted politically. Administrators from conquered peoples, including Persian bureaucrats and Chinese scholars, were frequently incorporated into Mongol governance rather than eliminated, producing hybrid systems of rule that blended steppe military organization with settled administrative expertise. The empire's unity, however, could not last. By the early 14th century, the 4 khanates operated as increasingly independent, often rival states, and by the mid to late 14th century, weakened by internal succession struggles, economic strain, and the same Black Death pandemic that the Mongol trade networks may have inadvertently helped spread westward, Mongol power receded across Eurasia. The Yuan dynasty was overthrown by the Ming in 1368. The Golden Horde fractured into successor khanates that Russian princes would spend centuries dismantling. The Ilkhanate collapsed into competing Persian dynasties. Yet the legacy of this era did not vanish with the empire's political unity. Modern nations across Eurasia, from China to Russia to Iran to the states of Central Asia, still bear administrative, cultural, and even genetic imprints of the Mongol century. Genghis Khan himself remains one of history's most consequential and contested figures, revered in modern Mongolia as the founding father of the nation, and remembered elsewhere as the architect of some of the deadliest campaigns of conquest the world has ever recorded. The story of the Mongol invasions resists easy moral resolution. It is a story of a marginalized boy who built the most feared military force in history through discipline, adaptability, and a ruthless understanding of human loyalty and fear. It is a story of ancient cities that never recovered, and of intellectual treasures lost to fire and river silt. But it is also, unmistakably, a story of a newly interconnected world, of trade networks and cultural exchange that reshaped how goods, ideas, and even diseases moved across continents for generations afterward. Few events in human history managed to be simultaneously so destructive and so transformative. The steppe that once seemed at the edge of the known world had, within a single lifetime, become its center, and the aftershocks of that transformation are still, in quiet ways, being felt today.